Somewhere in the spring of 2025, two things happened in the same week that almost no one connected. In Washington, the United States Supreme Court struck down the legal basis for sweeping tariffs that had been imposed on nearly every country on Earth. Tariffs that economists at the Peterson Institute for International Economics described as the highest average effective rate since 1947, the highest since the year the Marshall Plan was signed. And in Beijing, China celebrated the 80th anniversary of its victory over Japan by staging a military parade at which 26 world leaders stood as invited guests, watching the most visible display of Chinese military power in a generation, on a stage China alone had designed and China alone had convened. Two events, 1 week, one country announcing it would reorganize the rules of global trade unilaterally, and another announcing, in the language of ceremony and symbolism, that it now set the terms of global respect. These were not random occurrences. They were signals. Small, legible chapters in a story that has been building for decades. A story about a world order that is not collapsing, exactly, but reorganizing. And that reorganization, whether you follow geopolitics or not, whether you read foreign policy journals or simply pay your bills, is already arriving at your door. To understand where we are, you have to understand what was built and what is breaking. The world order that shaped the last 80 years was not nature. It was architecture. It was designed in the aftermath of the most destructive war in human history by a specific group of leaders with a specific theory that if you could build enough shared economic infrastructure, shared rules, shared institutions, shared financial systems, the countries inside that system would be more afraid to fight each other than to cooperate. The institutions that emerged were specific and deliberate. The United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which became the World Trade Organization, and above all, the dollar, cemented at Bretton Woods in 1944 as the architecture of global finance, the reserve currency in which oil was priced, debts were denominated, and the majority of global trade was settled. This system was imperfect. It was built around American primacy, and it served American interests alongside broader ones. But it was also the longest period without great power conflict in modern history. Historians of international relations call it the long peace, and its underpinning was not goodwill. It was interdependence, the mutual vulnerability created by a world so economically entangled that going to war meant destroying your own economy alongside your enemy. That architecture is now being dismantled, not by an adversary, from within. The most concrete and immediate expression of this is what happened to global trade in 2025. Beginning in February of that year, the United States imposed tariffs on virtually every major trading partner simultaneously: Canada, Mexico, the European Union, China, Japan, South Korea, and dozens of others. The stated rationale was reducing trade deficits and restoring domestic manufacturing. The economic reality, documented in parallel by the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, the Peterson Institute, the Bank for International Settlements, and economists at CEPR, was considerably grimmer. The Trump tariffs amounted to the largest U.S. tax increase as a percentage of GDP since 1993, an average tax increase per American household of $1,500 in 2026. Research from CEPR found that the tariffs were set to trigger sharp contractions in trade, significant welfare losses, especially for the United States, and major disruptions to global supply chains, with direct trade between the U.S. and China potentially collapsing by 90%. The Peterson Institute's modeling concluded that if left in place over the coming decade, these tariffs would result in less U.S. economic output, higher U.S. prices, and lower American wages than if they had not been adopted. But the economic damage was almost secondary to the geopolitical signal, because what the tariffs communicated to allies and rivals alike, without ambiguity, was that the United States was no longer committed to the rules-based trading system it had spent 80 years constructing. The WTO, which America built, was being circumvented. The alliances, which America had maintained, were being treated as liabilities rather than assets. The word that began appearing in diplomatic cables and think tank reports from Brussels to Tokyo to Canberra was one that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Unreliable. Europe and emerging powers alike began recalibrating their positions, reinforcing the trend toward what analysts were calling the Great Diversification across trade, security, and resources. Here is what that diversification looks like in practice, right now, in the architecture of the world economy. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, fortified by American arms, began diversifying their defense supplier base, acquiring Chinese drones and missile systems, marking a move toward a more multipolar Middle East, where Arab states are shaping outcomes not just as proxies of external powers, but as primary actors. India, whose prime minister had spent years carefully balancing between Washington and Beijing, demonstrated at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in 2025 that it would not be pressured into unilateral alignment with any single power. Brazil, which runs roughly balanced trade with the United States, found itself facing threatened 50% tariffs, a level that Peterson Institute economists estimated could reduce Brazilian GDP by up to 1%. Countries across the global south that had anchored their economic planning around stable American trade relationships began, with increasing urgency, exploring corridors that did not depend on Washington's predictability. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, analyzing geopolitical scenarios through 2030, concluded that the highest likelihood outcome for world order in the decade ahead would not be a unipolar order or a bipolar, Cold War-style competition, but a loose multipolarity, a world of multiple centers of power, multiple reserve currencies, multiple supply chain architectures, multiple alliances, and no single organizing principle to replace the one being abandoned. The Munich Security Conference made multipolarity its central theme in 2025, a choice that would have been extraordinary even 5 years earlier. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres described the current moment plainly. We are moving to a multipolar world, but are not there yet, in a purgatory of polarity where more and more countries are filling the spaces of geopolitical divides, doing whatever they want with no accountability. Purgatory of polarity. It is a phrase worth sitting with, because it captures precisely the danger of the transition, not the destination, but the passage. Periods between world orders are historically the most dangerous intervals in international relations, precisely because the rules that constrained behavior in the old system have lost their authority, and the rules of the new system have not yet been established. For you, sitting somewhere outside the halls of power, this transition is not abstract. Research published by the Bank for International Settlements found that manufacturing is the most affected sector due to its reliance on imported parts. But services also contract as they are interconnected with other sectors. The United States faces notable inflation, while some trading partners experience deflation as demand for their exports falls. The products you buy, electronics, pharmaceuticals, clothing, food, travel through global supply chains that were built over decades under the assumption of stable, predictable trade rules. Around 25% of CFO survey respondents were planning to reduce hiring and capital spending in response to tariffs in 2025. One manufacturing CFO captured the operational reality precisely. How can we plan if we do not know what the tariff situation will be for the next 5 years? Factory and supply chain sourcing decisions cannot be changed at a moment's notice. The uncertainty itself is the cost. Businesses do not invest when the rules of the game are unknown. They do not hire. They do not expand. They wait. And while they wait, the economy contracts in ways that show up not in dramatic crashes, but in the quiet accumulation of stalled wages, delayed opportunities, and prices that do not come back down. And yet, this is not the whole story. Buried in the disruption is something that the pure crisis narrative misses. A genuine and legitimate question about what kind of world order comes next, and whether the one being disrupted was as stable and just as its architects believed. The existing order concentrated the governance of global finance and institutions, where wealthy Western nations held structural majorities. It opened markets in ways that enriched some populations and hollowed out others. It created supply chain dependencies that turned out to be geopolitical vulnerabilities. Changes in the global economy, including the economic rise of Asia, demographic expansion in Africa, and the political maturation of Latin America, make a return to unipolarity unlikely. The question is not whether the old order returns. It will not. The question is what replaces it and who writes the rules of the replacement. At the close of 2025, the international system stood at a structural inflection point. The United States was redefining its global role. Europe was rearming and rediscovering its strategic voice. Russia's war in Ukraine continued without resolution. The world economy remained fragile. At the November APEC summit, the United States formally identified China as a peer rival, the first time since the Cold War that the United States had acknowledged another state as an equal structural competitor. That acknowledgement matters, because the transitions between world orders that ended most catastrophically -1914, 1939, were precisely the ones where the established power refused to acknowledge a changed reality until it was too late to manage the transition deliberately. The transitions that navigated the passage more successfully, the end of the Cold War, the post-war construction of Bretton Woods, were the ones where leaders, however, imperfectly attempted to build the new architecture rather than simply destroying the old one. So, what does a person do with this knowledge? Not panic, not paralysis, but a very specific kind of clear-eyed attention. The world is not ending. It is changing structure, at a speed and in a direction that most people's mental models of geopolitics were not built to track. The institutions that your parents assumed were permanent, the trading relationships, the alliance structures, the monetary architecture, the norms of international behavior, are being renegotiated simultaneously, in real time, with consequences that will compound for years. Your cost of living is connected to supply chains whose geography is being redrawn. Your employment security is connected to industries whose international competitiveness is being reshaped by tariffs and retaliation. Your government, as foreign policy choices, whoever makes them, will increasingly be made in an environment where the old certainties are gone and the new rules are not yet written. The people who navigate transitions like this most successfully are not the ones who ignore them or the ones who are paralyzed by them. They are the ones who understand the mechanism, who can read the signals embedded in a trade ruling and a military parade in the same week and understand what those signals mean together, not separately. Who can ask not just what is happening today, but what kind of world is being built by the accumulation of these choices, and who will be living in it. The Great Reset of global power is not a coming event. It is already underway, and the only question that remains is whether the people living through it are paying enough attention to shape it, or whether it will simply happen to them.